Mr. Johnson, a short story. On a cold autumn evening, a man was walking home from a long day at work. The sky was growing dark, and the man could feel the chill of the air penetrate in through his coat. He took the same cobbled path as every other day. He passed others in the village, and most would act in the same way. They would utter formalities like "Good evening" or "Hello, Mr. Johnson," and walk quickly past to avoid any conversation. Over time, Mr. Johnson had grown used to this and often didn't reply to their acknowledgments. This evening was slightly different, however. Even though it was as chilly as every other autumn evening, and Mr. Johnson took the same cobbled path as every other day, he made a friend. His friend was on the edge of the path. He stopped instantly as soon as he glanced sight of it. He knelt down and brushed away the overhanging grass in front of him to get a better view. His friend was a bird, a little brown sparrow that had broken its wing. This had never happened to Mr. Johnson before. He had no friends, no companions, and no pets. He looked around to check whether anyone was around. He saw no one in sight, only meadows and the border of the village a few yards down the path. He waited for a while, just watching the sparrow. It was badly injured and had trouble carrying its broken wing while attempting to walk. The sparrow kept falling back onto the grass and started to squawk in pain. Mr. Johnson began to feel anxious and decided to stand and walk away. But as he walked further, the sparrow's squawking got louder. 10 steps down the path, Mr. Johnson stopped. He still couldn't see anyone in the distance. He turned to look behind him and no one was there. The squawking got quicker as well as louder. Mr. Johnson turned and walked back towards the sparrow in trepidation. He bent down and slowly slid his hands under the bird. Holding the bird in one hand and shielding it from the wind in the other, he quickly headed home before night fell. Mr. Johnson returned to his little cottage on the other side of the village. He rustled around in his coat pocket with his free hand until he found the big copper key that opened the front door. Once unlocked, he pushed on the heavy door and walked straight towards the back entrance to the garden. The garden was mainly meadow with a single large shed in the middle, and Mr. Johnson headed straight to it. The shed was roomy and had multiple shelves on each side. "You will be safe in here," Mr. Johnson mumbled to the bird as he placed it down on the top shelf. On the floor was a huge bag of hay, and Mr. Johnson pulled out enough to provide some bedding for the little sparrow. The bird seemed more content and stopped its squawking. "I will come and check you in the morning," said the old man, as he closed the wooden door and bolted it from the outside. The next morning the little sparrow was attended to, as Mr. Johnson had promised. Peering up at the bird, the man asked, "How was your night?" The little sparrow's condition seemed to appear the same. "You may have to stay here a few more nights until your wing heals," Mr. Johnson assured the bird, "but you will be safe in here." Mr. Johnson had a wide smile on his face and left the bird some seeds that he had picked off one of his sunflowers. Everything else that day continued as normal, but the man felt energized and even greeted a fellow villager on the way home from work with a "Good evening, sir." The fellow man paused for a moment until he hesitantly replied back. Mr. Johnson fed and checked his little friend every dawn and dusk for the next few days. He now had light in his pupils that had once dimmed many years ago. Another day, Mr. Johnson rushed out to the house in torrential rain and unbolted the shed, leaving the door slightly open behind him. "Today, I have managed to gather some worms for you out of the soil," cheered Mr. Johnson. Looking up at the sparrow's man-made nest, nothing was there. A loud chirp came from another shelf on the opposite side of the shed. "There you are," said Mr. Johnson. The sparrow flew back across to him and picked one of the juicy worms out of his hand. "Looks like your wing is better then," uttered the man. He stood there in silence for a few moments while the sparrow gulped down the worm. "But you can't leave at this moment, while it's chucking it down with rain," he hesitated. A few more moments passed, and then a howling draught of wind blew into the shed. The sparrow flapped its wings and headed straight for the open gap. "You can't leave!" Mr. Johnson shouted, raising his arms up to catch his friend. Just before it escaped, he caught one of its legs in between his fingers. The bird started squawking in alarm while the man took a deep breath. A little snap, and the wing was once again broken. "I told you, you can't leave today. Look what you made me do." The sparrow's squawking stopped, like it knew that if it struggled, it might never fly again. Mr. Johnson dropped the last worms that were in his hand onto the floor and placed the sparrow back on the top shelf. He then left in silence and bolted the shed door once again. Weeks passed the incident in the shed, and there were more incidents to come, and the sparrow wasn't allowed to fly no more. On the other hand, Mr. Johnson's mood and energy was higher than ever. He regularly made conversation with other neighbours and villagers, and now knew a fair few by name, who he would meet in the local pub after work now and again. They too enjoyed the company of Mr. Johnson. A few months passed, and the sparrow was still imprisoned in the shed. It was now spring, and there were hundreds of birds to be heard, singing in the meadows. One spring morning, Mr. Johnson had a day off work, decided to go and hike to a nearby forest. He took with him a backpack with some equipment inside. Once he reached the forest, he took off his backpack and pulled out a net and some thick rope, which he used to start building a trap. After Mr. Johnson was finished, there was a tall, wide net between two tall trees. He then took a seat on the forest floor and waited. After a long day in the forest, Mr. Johnson began to walk back home before dusk turned into night. Carrying in his hands were two pairs of birds, which he had stuffed in little bags with only their heads poking out. They were still alive. Throughout the year, Mr. Johnson grew more popular with his fellow villagers, and soon thought of as the most joyous man in the whole village. Every few evenings, he would enjoy a night in a local pub with some of the neighbours, and often received a meal and a beer on the house from the head barman. One evening, he was having a meal with Mistress Cook, a pretty middle-aged lady, who had still not found a suitable husband after years of acquaintanceship with other men. This was not the first evening they had spent together, and Miss Cook was growing very fond of Mr. Johnson. "When will you invite me to your cottage?" she proposed. "Well, it's not very fit for a lady of your stature," said Mr. Johnson, with a big smile on his face. Miss Cook smiled back and blushed a little. "I'm being serious. I want to see your cottage. We've spent enough time with each other now, and I'm tired of formalities," she urged. "I know. It's just that it's quite noisy in my house," said Mr. Johnson. "Why?" replied Miss Cook. "I rescue and look after injured birds until they recover," he shared. "Wow. Well, I want to see them then," raised Miss Cook. Mr. Johnson looked down at his meal and paused for a few seconds. "OK, come round next week," he replied. "I can't wait," Miss Cook said ecstatically. So the following week came, and Miss Cook was knocking on Mr. Johnson's old cottage door. It opened, and he greeted her with a kiss on the cheek. "Come in," invited the old man. "Where are your birds?" inquired Miss Cook. "I keep them warm in the shed," as he pointed to it through the back window. "I will just find the keys," said Mr. Johnson. He led Miss Cook out across the shortly trimmed grass and unbolted the shed. Miss Cook could not hear any chirping or singing. Opening the shed door, a nasty stench immediately hit them. Miss Cook coughed a little and turned away to the fresh air. "All of them are injured, so don't worry about them flying at you," Mr. Johnson assured her. Following him into the shed, Miss Cook grew yet more uncomfortable, and the smile she greeted Mr. Johnson now began to fade. The shed was full of flightless birds, squashed together on the shelves with no room to move, lying in layers of excrement, and some even had a wing or two missing. The room was eerily quiet, and all that could be heard was the rustling of a couple of birds. Miss Cook noticed nets between each shelf. "Why are they trapped with nets if none of them can fly?" "Why are they trapped with nets if none of them can fly?" she muttered. "They aren't trapped," Mr. Johnson ensured. "It's for their safety, in case any fall off the shelf." He looked into Miss Cook's watery blue eyes. "What's the matter?" he asked. "I have to get out of here," Miss Cook replied, as she rushed out the door behind her. "Wait!" Mr. Johnson shouted. He decided not to follow as she left down the side of the cottage of her own accord. Mr. Johnson did not see Miss Cook again. He wondered if she had left the village, as he often went back to the pub where she used to be a regular visitor. Mr. Johnson had passed the peak of his sense of joy and euphoria that began when he had found his little friend on the side of a path over a year ago. His fellow villagers had also stopped greeting him in the streets and refused to acknowledge him when he greeted them. He was very confused and alone again. The little sparrow, which he had forced friendship upon, had also passed away. Since Miss Cook's disappearance, Mr. Johnson impulsively started to gather wood in the forest and began to build more sheds. When he was finally finished, there were 8 more in his garden. He continued his therapeutic practice of walking to the forest and trapping more birds until there were none left. Other villagers started to notice the silence of dawn and the empty nests in the trees surrounding the village. One day, Mr. Atkinson, the village baker, was walking his dog in the nearby forest at the break of dawn. He caught Mr. Johnson in the act from a distance. His guts churned at the sight of the paralysed birds and decided not to approach him. Atkinson and his well-trained dog walked away without drawing attention to themselves. That night Mr. Johnson was in the middle of bolting up all his sheds when he heard the growing sound of shouting and cursing from the direction of the village. He ran into his cottage and climbed upstairs to find a better view of the commotion. From his bedroom window he saw torchlights and pitchforks wielded by the villagers. Mr. Johnson watched them gallop across the meadow towards his cottage. Immediately he ran back down to the sheds, but by the time he got there the crowd had already reached him. Mr. Atkinson was in the crowd with his dog, which was now barking aggressively. "Let the birds go, Johnson!" shouted another man holding a pitchfork. "They're all I have," said Mr. Johnson, under the yelling of the villagers. "Where are the keys?" Mr. Atkinson shouted. Another man replied, "We don't need keys," as he walked up to the nearest shed carrying a shovel. The other villagers gathered behind him while he began to thrust the end of his shovel against the padlock. After a few thrusts, the padlock broke and a few villagers went into the shed. After a few minutes, a couple of birds flew out the door and the injured were carried out in sacks. Some of the villagers started to make the journey back to the village carrying full sacks. The others stayed to break into the remaining sheds. Mr. Johnson watched the villagers for as long as he could, brewing with anger and anxiety. When the villagers got to the final shed door, which happened to be the first shed that the little sparrow was once locked in, Mr. Johnson ran towards the villagers. He swung his fist into the face of the man attempting to break the padlock. The other villagers around him grabbed his arms and pulled him to the ground. Another villager grabbed a shovel and smacked Mr. Johnson on the head, knocking him unconscious. When Mr. Johnson woke, the pain immediately hit his head, so he turned onto his front, hoping that it would relieve the pressure. The shouting and cursing had stopped, and all Mr. Johnson could hear was a crackling sound. He could also feel an intense warmth from nearby. He opened his eyes and turned towards the sheds, what remained of them anyway. The villagers had dragged his unconscious body away from the sheds before igniting them. Mr. Johnson stared at the remaining ashes for a few moments until the pressure in his head came back. He managed to get to his feet and walk back into the cottage. Nowadays, Mr. Johnson exists as he once did before he met his little friend on the side of the path. He isn't acknowledged by his fellow villagers anymore, and he walks past them looking down at his feet. There isn't much more to say about him, apart from the fact that he's still searching for that sense of joy he had once discovered. The birds have forgiven Mr. Johnson and sing to him at dawn from their nests in the forest. That was Mr. Johnson, a short story by Carl Zeitgeist.